Hello and welcome to this session of the RUD 2020 Adoption Conference Reimagined, which focuses on adoptees as adults. My name is Hal Grotevant and I hold the RUD Family Foundation Chair at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and I'm pleased to serve as your host and moderator today. This session focuses on intergenerational relationships of adult adoptees from the perspectives both of research and lived experience. Although there's been quite a bit of research on adopted persons, the vast majority concerns children and adolescents. There's very little work on the topic of adult adoptees, and most of that focuses on individual mental health and adjustment. There's almost nothing on the topic of adoptees' relationships as adults, including relationships with partners or children, or the experience of parenting, or the important shifts that occur in families as adoptees become parents, namely that parents and birth parents become grandparents. So today's panel addresses all these important gaps and understudied topics. Today's presentation is actually composed of 4 video segments. 3 of today's panelists have already created and posted short 10 to 15 minute videos about their research featuring intergenerational relationships. So watching them first would provide you with good background for the present discussion. But never fear, today's presentation also stands on its own, and you can certainly return to the research videos at your convenience. Before we begin, I'd like to express my appreciation to our speakers and to our sponsors, whose generosity allows us to make this series available to all of you at no cost, wherever you might be and whenever you might want to tune in. I'd also like to acknowledge the other members of the program committee, Dr. Holly McGinnis, who's our program chair this year, Dr. Jen Dolan, RUD program manager, and Amanda Moore, our events coordinator and wonderful tech wizard. Today's session will begin with some opening words from each of our 5 speakers. I'll ask them to introduce themselves briefly and give a short overview of their perspective on intergenerational relationships. And then we'll have a group conversation, highlighting points of similarity and difference and underscoring some key takeaway points. So let me first name our 5 contributors and just say a tiny bit about them, and then we'll hear directly from them. Dr. JaeRan Kim is Assistant Professor of Social Work and Criminal Justice at the University of Washington, Tacoma. JaeRan will be talking about the experience of Korean adoptees who've become parents and how they think about cultural and ethnic and adoption-related socialization, reflecting on their past when they were children, but also on how they raise their own children. Dr. Julia Rimmer is Research Fellow at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, England. Julia will be talking about her research concerning young people who've been adopted through the care system in the UK and their experiences now as parents. Dr. Addie Wyman Battalen is a therapist and team leader in the Counseling and Mental Health Services Department at Harvard University and a lecturer at Boston College School of Social Work. Today, Addie will be focusing on her work about the realignment that occurs within families with open adoptions as birth mothers become birth grandmothers. Joe Kroll is Executive Director Emeritus of the North American Council on Adoptable Children, which he led for over 30 years and grew into an important international organization for advocacy, policy, and education in the field of child welfare. Joe will be sharing his perspectives as an adoptive parent and now an adoptive grandparent, while also leading an international organization focused on child welfare. Dr. Chris Downs is the principal at his Seattle-based company, the Downs Group, LLC, which offers training, assessment, and consultation to agencies that serve youth. Chris will be sharing 2 important personal perspectives. First, his experience in searching for and connecting with his own birth relatives as an adult just a few years ago. And second, on his experience in trying to become an adoptive parent as a gay man a number of years ago. So, JaeRan, if I could start with you, could you please share with us a few key points you'd like to make about your work and your perspectives on this topic of adult adoptees and intergenerational relationships?
Thank you so much, Hal. I want to start by saying that I was really drawn to this study because, as you mentioned, there's so little research that's been done on the adult adoptee experience, especially beyond young adulthood. And so the participants in our study, the median age was 41, which I think is somewhat unusual. And so that was exciting to me. Our study really highlights the three generations of family, from the adoptive parents and now grandparents, the Korean adoptees themselves who are the parents, and then their children. And both the reflections on their own parents, their adoptive parents, and their children come through the lens of the Korean adoptees themselves. And I think the main points are really that the adoptees had a really diverse range of socialization practices and thoughts about the importance of socialization, and they were different based on racial socialization, ethnic socialization, and adoption socialization. And that the adoptees that had younger children were more likely to emphasize ethnic socialization than the race or the adoption, while those that had older children or had children who were with partners that were not white were more likely to talk about racial identity with those kids and adoption. And that generally many of them felt that it was important to implement especially ethnic socialization strategies around their Korean heritage with their children, but many of them felt ill-equipped because they themselves growing up had limited exposure. And so they felt like they were kind of learning alongside with their children as they were trying to think about their ethnic heritage.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Addie, could I ask you to talk a little bit now about your work?
So I'll be talking about research that comes from the MTARP, the Massachusetts, Hal's one of the PIs, so I have to make sure to say that correctly, right? From the Minnesota, Texas Adoption Research Project, which is a longitudinal study looking at openness within adoptive families over the past over 30 years now. That began in the early 80s. And so I'll be talking about a study that we looked at from the perspective of the birth mothers and how their relationship evolved with the now adult adoptee, the child that they had a place for adoption many years ago as an infant. And what's exciting about this research is that a birth mother perspective, or from birth parents in general, is not usually heard. And so it's exciting to hear some experiences there, especially many years after the adoption placement, and also how the transition to parenthood can be such a catalyst for growth and closer relationships within intergenerational families.
Great, thank you. Julia, how about you? Could you say a word about your work?
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, great. So I suppose really the project that I'm reporting from, the presentation I've given is about adult adoptees, but the project itself is much bigger and is actually about intergenerational relationships. So we have the 40 adoptee parent interviews, but we also have 40 interviews with adopter grandparents. So we've got sort of interview data from those two generations, but talking about relationships between and across them, between the grandparents and the grandchildren, between the birth grandparents and the children, if there is a relationship there. So we've got a whole web of family relationships reported within the data set as a whole. The presentation that we've shared to accompany this discussion is based on the analysis of the adult adoptee parents, largely because we're a bit further ahead with the analysis there, but the analysis is ongoing. We've collected all the data, but we're a little bit further ahead with the adoptee parents. So that's what we're largely talking about today. The distinctiveness of our research, really, I suppose, is that it is a narrative analysis approach. So we've invited these adoptee parents or grandparents to give their life story. It's a very open kind of schedule that we go in with. So they tell very diverse stories and they can construct their stories however they like. So that's quite distinctive about the project. What's also distinctive is the context. So this project is largely looking at adoptions from the care system. So most of the existing literature on adoptee parents is mostly to do with relinquishments. But obviously there are various distinctive elements that come with being an adoption from care. So, you know, you've been taken away by the state from your birth family. You've got a number of vulnerabilities around maybe psychosocial problems, attachment problems, developmental issues. There's generally a transcultural class issue. So mostly it's middle class adopters taking on, you know, children from usually what are lower class families. So there's issues around that as well. And this sort of from care move has largely been within the last 30 years. So most of the parents in our study are quite young parents of quite young children, and most of them have become parents quite young as well. So it's a very diverse sample. Because there's so little research in this area, we intentionally recruited a very diverse sample. So we had kind of quotas around certain issues like age at adoption, and whether the adoptees see their children or not. That was also something that we wanted to include. So we wanted to include adoptee parents who don't see their children for various reasons. But there's also the issue of where they're at in their life stage when they're being interviewed. Some of the parents are quite young. Some of them have had children young, but are now a little bit older. So they're looking back with more kind of perspective. For most of them, the transition to parenthood was wanted, but kind of unplanned. So a lot of them talk about wanting to be a parent or knowing that they wanted to have children, but not really talking about that in terms of how it's related to adoption until maybe later in the interview, if at all. But there's a general thrust that they want to be parents, but it happens quite quickly in their lives. So the stories are often about needing a lot of support with the transition from their adoptive parents or from any other source that they can get it, really. And most of them are quite unprepared for the issues that come with parenthood in terms of their identity and the sort of other issues that are provoked to do with their birth families and, you know, the sort of care experiences, pre-care experiences they've had, or maybe their attachment issues in their adoptive families. But most of them frame their kind of transition to parenthood in relation to sort of wider narratives around intergenerational cycles of abuse and neglect. So being adopted was supposed to be the intervention by the state that breaks the cycle of abuse within families. So they're always talking about becoming parents in relationship to that. That's very much in the background that frames their transition to parenthood from both generations' interviews. So it's, you know, whether they've managed to break the cycle of abuse and neglect, or the internalized version of that, you know, am I going to repeat the problems that my birth mother had or my birth family had? You know, that kind of fear of doing that and desperation to do a better job. So really that's kind of giving you a broader sense of the project as a whole. The presentation as itself, that it stands, is mostly about the adult adoptees. And I should finally say that this is Elspeth Neal's project. She's the professor on the study. I'm the research fellow, and there's also Dr. Irina Serbu. So the three of us are working quite closely on the analysis of the data and have collected the data as a team as well. So it's very much an ongoing team effort.
Great, thank you very much. And just to be clear, so Julia and Addie and JaeRan all have prepared the individual short videos about their work. So those are on the separate videos you can click on and take a look at to kind of supplement this discussion that we're having here. So next, Joe, could you talk a little bit about your situation and what you'd like to share about intergenerational relationships?
I'd be glad to, and I'm honored to be invited to this group and somewhat humbled by the discussion of the fine research of the three previous speakers, because when you get right down to it, mine is an experiential world that is focused on a very small nuclear family of with my wife, Becky, 51 years of marriage, a son who will be turning 50, a birth son, who still works at NACAC, Josh Kroll, and then our adopted daughter, who joined our family in 1976 right before she turned 5 months old, which I think might be a record for a Korean adoption placement, to have her join the family so soon after a referral. And we were very lucky to have her join our family. That also is informed by the thousands of parents and adoptees and foster youth that I've worked with over the years. And I think that a key message, two key messages that I will elaborate on. One is the support for the culture of a person of color joining your family from day one, and through their identity search and their adulthood. And it's, as I said earlier to my daughter when I was talking, I said, you know, you've never been successful with your birth family search, but you've been very successful with your cultural search. And growing up as a Korean mother and woman. And the other thing, as a parent, that I guess I've lived over time is to be there for your children and your grandchildren, and to be invested in their lives and their activities. And the more time you commit, the greater the payoff for everybody. For your children and your grandchildren, and to be invested in their lives and their activities. And the more time you commit, the greater the payoff for everybody.
Thank you, Joe. And I do have to compliment you on your T-shirt, on your grandparenting T-shirt, and on, you want to say a word about the in behind you, the tapestry?
Yes, from the when Sophie was born in 2008, a picture was taken with her facing me, and I said, "Man, I'd love that on a T-shirt." And so for the last 12 years, I have collected T-shirts with my grandchild and then grandchildren on them. And my wife at Christmas time was able to take those T-shirts, the images that are on the T-shirts, and send them away someplace. And this wonderful quilt came back with 12 years of pictures. But I wear these T-shirts everywhere when I'm with the kids, partially as a cleaning, but partially if someone is snooping around going, "Who's this old white guy with these adorable Korean kids? What's that all about?" So the claim is right there on my chest and my back. Usually they have something on the back too. Thanks for asking.
Thank you. And Chris, let's hear from you. Could you tell us a bit about your perspectives?
Sure. Thank you, Hal. I'm delighted to be part of this conversation. As I was preparing today, I was reminded that this really is the first time I've been asked to present from a personal perspective on this issue. Much of my research has been nuts and bolts research and data and analysis and reporting. And so this is a first for me. Again, I'm Dr. Chris Downs. I was placed into foster care at birth in South Bend, Indiana in the 1950s. I remained in the care of Catholic Social Services for the first 2 years of my life, and I was adopted at age 2 and reared as an only child in a nearby town. I had an uneventful, pleasant childhood. Went to college in South Bend, Indiana University, South Bend, where I got my bachelor's degree in psychology and sociology. Went on, and this is where I met Hal at the University of Texas at Austin, where I got my PhD in developmental psychology. I want to give you a brief review of my professional history before I segue to the personal experiences, because I think they're highly relevant. I began my professional history at the University of Houston. Really was my first long-term teaching position. I taught the psychology courses. While I was at U of H, and I published over 50 journal articles, a couple of books at the University of Houston. I rose from assistant to associate, finally a full professor with tenure in 1991. During my time in Houston, my volunteer work had included street outreach to homeless and displaced youth and in AIDS caregiving. Neither Houston nor Texas were especially welcoming or safe places to be an out gay man at that time. This is the 1980s. So my partner and I moved to Seattle in 1992. Here in Seattle, I managed a large transition center, which included many young people moving through career development and search activities. That really firmed up my passion for working with older youth, especially those making significant transitions in their lives. From there, I was hired at Casey Family Programs headquarters here in Seattle in 1994. I served as director of research there at Casey and later as director of services to older youth. I'm one of the primary co-authors of the fairly massive Casey alumni studies that were published by Oxford University Press in 2010. Usually when I participate in events like this, it is from the perspective of talking about the Casey alumni studies. While I was at Casey, I also developed a number of life skill assessment resources and tools that have since that time been used by over 2 million parents and youth. In 2008, Casey went one direction, I went another. They started to focus more on infants and prevention, and I continued doing what I had been doing since the 1980s, and that was focusing my work on older youth living in substitute care. So in 2008, I opened my own company, the Downs Group. Our mission has been to improve services and outcomes for youth living in substitute care. We have done a great deal of assessment, training, and consultation with agencies large and small across the United States. I want to now segue to my own experience. You have that background, but let me give you a little bit more of a fill in. My experience as an out gay professional who tried very hard to adopt children in the 1980s in Texas. I want to start there. I think that's an important perspective to offer. As an adoptee, and as a person who was out, I was very committed to adopting. I was so compassionately committed to it, as was my partner. We knocked on the doors of many private agencies, including DePelchin Faith Home, Baptist Children's, and many others. When all of them said no, 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 we tried the state agency and we got no, no, no. We started to get, well, maybe if you will take medically fragile babies. Neither my partner or I had that kind of training or skill. And at that time, about 1981, 82, HIV AIDS emerged. A number of our significant friends in the community became ill, and I became a volunteer AIDS caregiver instead. So that switched my attention from adoption. Then the other highly relevant experience happened in 2017 when my bio niece found me on one of the DNA matching sites. Up to that point, I had no idea who any of them were. And I learned an incredible amount. I think one of the important points I want to share with you is that from the time I was a child until the time I was an adult, I invented convenient stories as an adoptee who had no reference to that background, stories to tell, whether as a child, and I had been given a couple of tales my grandmothers had given me about, well, you came from a huge family and they couldn't afford you. All those tales and stories that we carry that become part of us, all of that flew out the window in 2017 when this amazing, lovely niece contacted me and said, I think you're either my cousin or my uncle. Could we talk? Could we communicate? I'll remind you, I was reared as an only child. The reality was I had a total of nine half brothers and sisters, 7 of whom were still alive when I learned of all of this. One of the most important points I can share with you, and I continue to tell other adults and young people or searching for their biological relatives, be very careful what you search for. Be very careful. I've started using some of those experiences as part of the permanency trainings that I do with social workers around the country to emphasize that care about the psychology of the individual in seeking that family is extremely important. I also talk about retaining control of the search, controlling the information you receive about biological relatives, and asking a reflective question. Do I really want to know this? And why do I want to know this? How will it add to my life today? Also, the flow of the information received needs to be controlled. Do I need to take a break from this search? Do I need to process what I've just learned with someone who truly cares and understands me? The adult adoptee has to identify really in advance who her or his social supports are as they go through such a search. Mine was the cousin I grew up with and my husband. Without the two of them, I could not have done this. I absolutely could not have done this. And I'm a mature adult. I think I've got it together. And part of the discoveries were crushing. They were very difficult and they impacted and to a large degree dispelled those stories that I had about myself growing up. Those I found were convenient truths that I had invented because I'm a very light-skinned Caucasian and I have blue eyes and I'm freckled. I had invented stories of being Irish or Polish. That was simply not true. I am a little over 50% German from Baden, about 24% English, and the rest of it from yes, 24% English from South Central England, and the rest Scandinavian. No Irish, no Polish. My journey of discovery was also made much easier because the biological relative who found me to begin with did so in a loving, supported, encouraging way. I really lucked out. Since 2017, I've heard many stories of people who were not so fortunate, who were not so lucky in their journey of discovery. Of the 9 half siblings, 2 flat out rejected me. First was an older sister who did not have the time, but wished me well. The second, a younger brother, called me a very nasty name for gay men and had nothing to do with me, did not want anything to do. 2 others welcomed me, an older brother whose name, curiously, was also Chris. He looked like my twin. We talked alike. We looked alike. We had different birth fathers, same mother. I did get to visit him in person 3 times, and he died only a couple of months ago, which is another complicator to get to know someone during a process like this, only to lose them. How do you manage that kind of loss of a biological relative at such a senior age? And also, I met a younger sister, and she and I have developed a really nice relationship. The rest I can't find, or they're already dead. I think the biggest bottom lines from my experience are to be extremely careful what you search for, be prepared for what you find, and have a solid personal and social support net around you. In 2016, I knew absolutely nothing about any of them. Today, I know more about my biological ancestry than most people do. I've located nearly 1,500 ancestors, and they're stretched back to Charlemagne himself and to a couple of the notorious Vikings who sacked Paris and parts of England. I've worked on detailed histories of 4 related members of my bio family, my mother's side, and I have been doing a lot of writing. The first of a 4-novel series will be published in January. Thanks for letting me share my story.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much. As I'm hearing all of your talking, I'm really the idea of stories and narratives and all of those seem so central to how we think about our connections across these generations. I mean, even if we just think about ourselves, the idea of who we are, that's our identity, and that's a story in itself. But then the greater story is also how does that connect both to the generations above us and to the generations who will follow us. So I think this theme is a really important one, and I think we'll be kind of returning to it a number of ways during this conversation. Maybe a next kind of topic to move on to is this idea of becoming a family, and how you think about what that story of that next generation will be, and the experience of becoming a parent, and how those experiences may bring up some adoption related issues that are either new or that may have been dormant for a period of time. So, Julia, I was wondering if we could start with you and you could talk a little bit about this idea. And I know you did allude to it a bit in your earlier remarks, but maybe talk a little bit more about this experience of becoming a parent, and how are the young people in your study kind of experiencing that, and what are the issues that they're dealing with?
Yeah, thank you, Hal. And it's great to hear from everybody else. So thank you for that. Yeah, we have spoken to 20 adoptee mothers and 20 adoptee fathers. I should say the fathers were much more difficult to recruit than the mothers. Um, and I think the average age of the men we recruited is actually older. So some of them are actually relinquished adoptions as well. So we did have to sort of broaden the criteria because it was proving so difficult to find adoptee dads from within the last 30 years who would talk to us. I don't think a lot of them are connected to anything around their adoptive identity. And some of the grandparents who sort of brokered the involvement of their daughters in our research did have sons who might be eligible, but they wouldn't take part, or they were deemed to be too vulnerable. So that's quite interesting, the sort of gender difference in your willingness and ability to talk about these things to somebody else and to put a narrative together. So that's kind of one of the first things, is how easy it is for people to talk about it. The mothers we spoke to, most of them talked about wanting to be a mother from an early age, but most of them didn't really ground that in anything to do with adoption explicitly. A few of them did, but a lot of them just said, I always wanted to be a mother. And they didn't really plan motherhood. They kind of let it happen in the context of a relationship, usually quite young. But from the point of view of where they're at the time of the interview, most of them talk about parenthood as being ultimately a sort of positive transformation of their lives for the better. So for most of them, it's been something that's been a new identity, has moved them away from being stuck on their adoptive identity, to invest instead in a child and in the future rather than dwelling on their past and their childhood. So it's given them a new focus. But most of them did talk about, in hindsight, having been unprepared for the whole process and what it would rake up and how they would be in the middle of it all, trying to negotiate all these feelings and relationships and changes. So that reflection definitely came through from the mothers and the fathers, actually. But yeah, slightly different experiences because of the relinquishment sort of element for some of the fathers. And definitely the fathers seem to be much, have many more internal anxiety issues that have been dealt with later in life. So the women seem to have processed things more easily than the men. The men who have processed things and can talk about them are giving us great insights, but I think there's a massive unmet need there of men who are really struggling with processing all of this. So most of the adoptees who've come through all this talked about needing to be able to fix and resolve issues stemming from their past before they become a parent, but that being very difficult. It's all right saying that now, but how do you do that for young people if they want to become parents young and they want a new identity as a parent? Maybe they haven't had a very good educational experience and work's a bit tricky. Maybe relationships with the opposite sex or the same sex are tricky. So, wanting this new relationship with a child gives them a real sort of firm footing and sense of belonging in the world, but they're not really ready for it. So it's kind of a double bind, in that as an older adult, you know that you needed to fix these things before you became a parent, but wanting to become a parent is the overriding thing as a young adult. So it's a difficult one to square. They talk about, you should try and fix and resolve those issues around your identity and your birth family and trauma from pre-care, care experiences, but to sort all that out before the age of parenthood is a big task. So that's kind of one of the major findings. Also, kind of trust in relationships is an issue for quite a lot of the adoptee parents. So, romantic relationships, there's quite a lot written on that in terms of adopted adults and difficulties with trust, permanency of relationships and things like that. So, we've got quite a lot of domestic violence in the backgrounds of some of these people who've got into relationships with the wrong type of people in their youth. So that's an issue that maybe has come up quite a bit. There's also been the massive issue for these adoptees around the stigma of being care experienced. So if you're a sort of pregnant woman in the UK, when you go through the paternity services, you will be asked whether you've spent any time in the care system. And that triggers a certain amount of interest in your past and your ability and capacity to parent. So some of the people in our study have talked about having real struggle navigating that process of the stigma of being care experienced and having to fight their corner and needing support to fight their corner to become parents. Basically, they're young usually when they become parents, and this care experienced label is really used against them by most professionals, unfortunately. So they're having to fight that stigma, people questioning their ability to parent. Also, their adopters who are now grandparents are often struggling with that as well, knowing that their children might be struggling with parenting issues, but how do they get help for them and support them? And do they need to get social services involved in that? If their, young adult child is, using drugs or, doing other things that are potentially harmful for the child, that's definitely in the data as well. So a whole host of issues really about support for this transition. From the adoptive grandparents' perspective, the big thing that adopters need to be prepared for is the fact that for most of these adopted adults, they are transitioning to adulthood later than their contemporary peers. So they're needing support for longer, more intensive support with practical and emotional issues. And they're often, some of the adoptive grandparents talk about incessant parenting. So they've never stopped parenting. The grandchildren just arrive and it's never stopped. There's not been any natural breaks that their peers have had, perhaps. Ideas they had about maybe, going on cruises or enjoying a kind of relaxed grandparenthood have not really transpired, that they're very much involved in their grandchildren's lives. Some of them are happy with that, but others it's incessant and it's very demanding of their resources and time and energy. So yeah, I could talk for hours on this. I'm going to wrap it up there.
Okay. Well, we'll come back to you, so don't go anywhere. So that's really, really helpful. JaeRan, I'm wondering, you have a sample of also adults who are becoming parents. And so I'm wondering how similar and different and what kinds of things you're seeing in your group.
As I was listening to Julia talk, I was just struck by how different our sample was, compared to some of the themes that Julia was talking about. Um, our sample didn't really talk much about what inspired them to become parents, or that wasn't really much of a theme, but they did talk a lot about some of the emotions and the feelings they had once they became parents. And one of the things that I think was really a strong, powerful theme was that, especially for those who had children by birth, how strong um, of an emotion it was to know that their child was related to them, because most of them did not get adopted with biological siblings, so it was the first time that they had anybody in their family that was genetically related to them. And that was a really powerful emotion for many of them. Um, Physically looking like their child was also really powerful. Um, the other thing is that different milestones in their own children's development struck them in powerful ways. So, for example, and I'm this is something as a Korean adoptee who's a parent. My kids are 22 and 26. I remember also having some of these same feelings when they were the age that I entered care.
Mm.
And then kind of thinking back and saying, "Oh, wow, okay, I was a year and a half when I entered my first orphanage, and my child's a year and a half now. I can't imagine placing them in an orphanage at this time, or the age that I was almost 3 when I was adopted. So then when my children were almost 3, thinking through, I would have, based on what my kids are talking and how they recognize me, I would have remembered or felt that loss. So some of those things that maybe as I was growing up before having children, I might not have really considered quote unquote an adoption issue are bringing up some of those feelings around adoption, because a lot of adoptees don't really, unless they have parents or therapists that kind of introduce adoption as a topic, they may not consciously know that they're thinking about adoption until it comes out in these other ways. um, and so I think those were really some of the findings that I thought were super interesting to me. um, and I think just helping the adoptees also then thinking about in terms of like the intergenerationality of it, um, explaining to their own parents about how important it was. Not all of their adoptive parents understood the draw to having a child genetically, and so kind of helping to understand why it meant so much to have a child that looked like them. And I was going to bring this up a little bit later too, around some of the parents had adopted children. And the other thing that I think was very interesting is that, there was a segment of our sample who was very interested in adopting because they themselves had been adopted and it was a good experience for them. But all of them adopted Asian children. All of the Korean adoptees adopted Asian children. So even though it didn't seem as if the biological connection part mattered as much, definitely the racial uh, similarities seemed to matter, even though they didn't explicitly say so. And, we weren't looking to see, we didn't ask questions about adoption for those that had adopted. And that would be a great follow up study to learn more about that.
Can I just add in actually with
Mhm.
talking about that, JaeRan, about the wanting to see your resemblance in your child. It's quite a complex issue in our sample because often, although they're not open adoptions, there's an element of openness with letterbox contact and maybe memories of living in your sort of birth family or first family that are tied up with abuse and neglect often. So it's often a difficult set of memories to see imprinted. Some of them talked about not wanting their children to look like birth family members, which is quite difficult for some of them, and that
Mhm.
being difficult. And also, one of them talked about wanting plastic surgeries that she didn't look like her mother, which is quite extreme. But so there's a whole that complicates things a little bit, because often, they are, some of them are adopted with siblings as well. So they do have a good sense of what their blood relatives look like. And
Mhm.
depending on how they feel within the context of their adoptive family, whether it's a transracial element or, whether they felt like they fitted in or not, that does play out in the need and desire to have your own child and what they look like. And yeah, it's complex, isn't it? It's very
It is
interesting.
very, very complex. Yes.
Well,
Gotta
Joe,
jump
I'm
in.
wondering from your experience as an adoptive father and grandfather, but also from your years of working in NACAC, where one of the important components of that work is supporting new adoptive parents or prospective adoptive parents. How does all this ring to you? What do you kind of see in this that may be kind of really similar or different?
I'm ready to go. This next segment really is talking a little bit about what I used to do when I did transracial adoptive parenting training and shared our very, very fortunate experience Becky said to me before I started, she says, now be humble. And I said, okay, I'll be humble, but what I'm really is lucky. We were so lucky to adopt in Minnesota. It started really within 3 months of our daughter joining our family and getting around the rules of the agency, which I won't talk about publicly. But when the adoption was finalized, our daycare provider, who lived around the corner, was a Korean immigrant, and she literally asked to be able to be a daycare provider for our daughter. And so I had all this wonderful opportunity for our daughter to have that continuing Korean cultural experience from ages 1 to 4, and having that person really give me some cultural training. It's like I show up to pick her up, and she's a year old, and she's eating little pieces of cabbage on her tray, and she's crying, and I go, "What's going on here?" And Mama Yoon says, "If she doesn't appreciate kimchi before she's a year old, she'll never appreciate it." And I went, "Okay, that's right." And as she grew up, she taught me how to make bulgogi, japchae, and mandu on each of my daughter's second, third, and fourth birthdays. And so we had this relationship. And then we were in Minnesota, where the Korean adoptive community was huge. And an organization called Ours was very active at the time. And there were all kinds of cultural opportunities through camps, through Children's Home Society. And what's so interesting is we took advantage of literally everything. And our daughter seemed to enjoy it. And then she became a teenager. And she was at one of the children's homes gatherings, and all these other kids from around the suburban area, JaeRan knows what I'm talking about here, would come into children's home, and it'd be the first time they'd see a Korean kid. Well, we had 5 Korean kids living on our block, so that was not unusual. And so when my daughter was asked, "What do you like about, why do you come to these meetings?" She goes, "The food." And it was like, okay. And through her high school years, she was an athlete and captain of the gymnastics team. And so her group really were the athletes. And she really, as she admits, she like didn't want to think about being Korean or Asian or interact with anybody, even though one of her best friends today was a schoolmate who kids used to confuse them because they looked so much alike. They would call each other their names, but she didn't want to be Korean. And she went away in college to Stout in Menominee, Wisconsin, where all of a sudden she was slammed with being different. And it opened her eyes, and she really began that cultural journey. And what I think is what's important that I always tell the parents is when your child begins those journeys of identity, you support them. You when someone says, "I want to figure out what it is to be Korean," you support that. And I've heard too many stories of adoptive parents who think they're being rejected. And it's like, that's crazy. Everybody forms an identity. And if they're working on an identity that is related to their ethnicity, then you support them. And I remember, and this is back to JaeRan's point, she was probably 19, and she came into the family room, and she sits down and says, "Dad, this is really serious. I got to talk to you." And I says, "What?" She says, "It's really important to me because no one in my family looks like me, that I marry a Korean man, and that I have children that look like me." And I think I shared the picture with everybody. She like succeeded beyond belief. And her daughter is just, a double of her. But my response was, "That's wonderful." And it's like, this is, I don't know how this will be taken, but it says, Korean babies are really cute, especially the hair that stands up for the first 6 months.
They are.
And it was like, just so embracing that part of her journey. And then as she got deeper into it, left Stout after a year, which is a whole other story, came back, lived at home, went to the university, and interacted with Korean students at the university who were adoptees, first generation immigrants, and foreign exchange students. And those, but that became her group. And she went as far as she could with Korean language at the university, and then went to Yonsei for a quarter, and then a couple of years later went back for a year and a half to really learn the language. But supporting that cultural search is a message I give to parents. And I was lucky with all the interactions I had and the training. It's like that's the right thing to do, not this is a rejection. And so I think that really was critical. And it was difficult at times within the family. Anytime you have a family gathering and there's this one person who does not look like everybody else. And I remember one very painful time where people were doing characteristics with our fingers about how they split or whatever it was at the time. And she goes and looks under the table, and hers didn't do that, and she left the room. And I knew there was something wrong. And she just says, "I'm different, but you're accepted. But I'm different, and no one is like me." And you have to embrace that. And I think the biggest mistake we made was that, as I've learned over time, is there should have been a Korean sister for her. We should have adopted again, because as I've met young Korean women who worked at NACAC who were adopted, not with siblings but multiple Korean adoption, they had someone to talk to and share with, and she didn't have that growing up when she needed it directly. And so that was something that we did miss. I'll save the grandparent part for another question.
Okay, we'll come there. But I think your point about being different but being accepted is such a really important point. And Chris, I'm wondering if you wanted to say a word about that, given your experience in the 80s of trying to become an adoptive parent, and how does that experience contrast with what's happening today as you see people in your community and your friends who may be seeking to adopt or have already adopted?
Yes, I think more LGBT people, adults, are trying to adopt than ever before, but that's very much geographically based, at least as I'm observing it around the United States. Perhaps in England it might be very different, but here you have states like Washington, Oregon, California, New York, Minnesota, where they have embraced the LGBT community. I know here in Washington, the state actively recruits at every gay pride event. Things have changed. There's more of a welcoming environment. That said, there are still significant barriers for those who are adults but who spend any time in foster care, were adopted. There are certain assumptions, and I've had rich conversations with individuals who have tried to adopt as gay men and lesbians, trying to adopt here in Washington and in other places in the country. And there are barriers almost instantly set up for those prospective adults that are not, they're just not there for the heterosexual prospective adopting parent. One is the whole coming out. How out are you? When did you come out? That whole process. That was true in the 80s. It is true now. Um, the whole piece about how mature are you? There is an assumption that the heterosexual adult coming in, there you can do a clinical perspective on them and say, yeah, they're probably pretty mature. The LGBT identified person coming in, often there's an additional hurdle where they must demonstrate a degree of maturity that otherwise might not need to be demonstrated. And all of these were barriers I found back in the 80s. There's the question about partnership and stability. We all know that all relationships, all coupled relationships, get challenged here and there. Some go on the rocks, some end in divorce or splitting up. But there's an assumption that the LGBT relationship is less inherently stable. There are less social and environmental supports for those relationships to adopt. compared with heterosexual individuals. Um, I think those are the biggest barriers that I found then, of course, back in the 80s. And to some extent, we're finding that again today. Uh, Many parochial private agencies were empowered back then to just simply say no, unless you want to take this very difficult child, unless you want to adopt this child that perhaps you're not even ready to take care of. You still see that with a number of states passing laws that agencies don't have to place with highly qualified LGBT prospective adopting parents. So my experience back in the 80s was awful. I came to terms with that. I think in many respects, I channeled my energy to serve as a parent into my godson, into other forms so that I could care for young people. Certainly, my work in street outreach in Houston was a lot of that in caring for those young people, but not in direct care because of being an out gay man.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. Yeah. Well, let's shift a little bit and talk about multi-generational relationships because the puzzle gets even more complex when we add grandparents and grandparenting to this. And Addie, I wanted to bring you into the conversation and find out a little bit about your work and how do these family systems become more complicated when a child is born and the parents now become grandparents, and how do they navigate that and negotiate that?
Yeah, and I think I've heard a couple times that family relationships are complex, and we definitely saw that in our study too. And with this sample, the adult adoptees were in their 30s, and so the children were anywhere from newborn babies up to 5 years old. So really, in this, the communication was that the adult adoptees were kind of the gatekeeper in some way between were they going to share their child, their new baby, in some ways to their birth parent, specifically to their birth mother, and welcome them, invite them into their family to say, you can take on the role of grandmother. You can also be a grandmother here, along, often, many times, alongside an adoptive grandmother, other grandparents that were present in the picture. And so that was a complex relationship and entryway to navigate for many of the birth mothers that we interviewed. And all of the birth mothers had been in some form of contact with the child since the placement. For some, it had been many years where they hadn't had that ongoing contact. But often that catalyst of an adult adoptee becoming a parent was when they would reach out to their birth mother and say, like, hey, let's talk. I want to share this news with you. I'm humbled by the experience of being a parent and how much responsibility it is. Or now I'm starting, kind of going back to what JaeRan was saying, reflecting on what was this like for my parent when I was this age, but in a different way. Yeah, so just really an invitation, an opportunity for the relationship to reconnect or to grow.
Can I can I jump in and just
Yeah.
add on to that? That makes me think about some of the parents, especially some of the mothers in our study, said that they felt much more empathy for their birth mothers while they were pregnant and after having their children because they understood better what a sacrifice it must have been for them to place their child.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah,
What
I'm
about
both.
this idea of gatekeepers? I think that's such an interesting idea because the more people are involved in a complex family, the more potential there is for conflicts. And I don't mean necessarily interpersonal conflicts, but just, logistical things like coordinating things and who can go where and when and who's going to go to graduation or a wedding or whose house are we going to go to for Thanksgiving or something like that. So I'm curious about other perspectives on gatekeeping. Have any, and would invite anybody else to jump in on that point.
Um, I might say a little bit here about the difference between mums and dads.
Yep.
Often it is the adoptee, as Addie said, who is the kind of gatekeeper. They're the one who decides which sections of the family are still in contact and see who and what the nature of that relationship is. But I think for adoptee dads, it's often their female partners, because they are all straight couples in our study. It's often the partner who has pushed them to search or pushed them to think more about it. Maybe because that's around getting information in pregnancy, you know, in terms of genetic risk from their birth, the paternal birth family side. And so there's more of a, oh, you know, aren't you interested in thinking again about this? And so although the adoptee is the gatekeeper, I think in the case of adoptee dads, the relationship with the partner is a little bit more in the mix. The sort of, you know, the non-adopted partner, female partner, the mother, has a bit of an effect on the father's feelings around those managing those relationships. So that's kind of an interesting gendered aspect to the gatekeeping, I think.
Mhm.
Yeah, we saw some of those gender patterns too. The sample is pretty small, but also all heterosexual couples for the adoptees. And, you know, there's been some earlier research about how mothers are sometimes the social coordinators. And so they're the ones who are planning the family picnic. So if you're going to get an invite, it needs to go through them. Kind of similarly, some of our adult adoptees who were male, their wives were the ones who posted on Facebook or posted on social media photos of the kids. So if you could be their Facebook friend in some ways, then you would have access to pictures and contact.
So that raises this issue of technology, you know, and because we are really moving into, or we're already in a world really where technology is so important for staying in touch and for connecting people. So I'm interested in any comments that people have about the role of technology in either in the work that you're doing or in the work that you're talking about today.
So we had a small number in our study who had found their birth families in Korea, and so they were using technology, not Zoom at that point, but usually Skype, or there's a number of different apps that are text apps. So they would be in touch with their Korean families, and it was some interesting conversations around introducing their children to their Korean grandparents. Many of them didn't have long-standing connection, so they had found their Korean parents as adults in a search, sometimes with the support of their adoptive parents and sometimes without. And like Julia was saying, some of those relationships were tense and not necessarily um, solid and good relationships that they had with their Korean families, but most of them were still trying to have some kind of contact with them. And so introducing grandchildren to that, a lot of the Korean families, the adoptees would talk about how the Korean grandparents were very interested in having that relationship and that contact. But depending on the stability of the relationship the adoptee had with their Korean birth family, there was some gatekeeping that could happen there. And then, but I think some of them expressed that they would still want that relationship because they themselves felt insecure about what they could bring in terms of the Korean ethnic heritage to their children. And so having access to Korean grandparents was like the most natural way that they, and kind of an authentic way that they could expose their children to their Korean culture. And so I thought that was also really, really an interesting aspect.
When Eli was born, he was here in Minnesota, and so he was like connected and saw us almost every day. And two of the things that stand out, because he was not involved with dad's side Korean family who were all in New York, is that when we went to New York City for his first birthday, for that big celebration, and everybody's there, and I'm basically managing Eli because I'm the familiar face, and his father's uncle comes up to him and says, "Does Eli recognize you?" How does Eli identify that? And like Eli just always accepted that. And I remember another time when he went to school, he had to give his whole name, Eli Jung. And so we're practicing. I said, "Okay, now what's your name again?" He goes, "Eli Jung." And what's my name? And he goes, Papa Jung. And that was one of those moments of acceptance that's like, okay, this works. And just having the opportunity, now retired for 5 years, to spend all this time, meet the buses, run the show in the summer. The kids don't look like me, but boy, they're as much a part of the family as anyone could possibly be. And I talk sometimes with Becky about it. And I said, it's unfortunate because as retired people, we're spending more quality time than we had the time to do with our kids when we were raising them because we were so busy with work and school. And to Julia's comment way back at the beginning about grandparents were planning on doing this travel and what have you, and then they started taking care of the grandkids. Until COVID hit, we did maintain our travel. And I remember quite clearly in just the last year, both Eli and Sophie would say, are you going on a trip? And why are you not taking us with you? Because in the winter, we would go to Puerto Rico and they would come down for a week and join us. But it was like they expected to travel with us when we traveled, and we had to kind of dispel that thought that they got to go to school, etc. But that connectedness is just been so great. And it's like what I always say, when you have grandparents who are engaged and welcomed, that it's a win, win, win. Everybody wins in that. Grandparents obviously get a lot. The kids get another set of adults who think they're wonderful and help with their self-esteem. And the parents have opportunities for breaks with someone else to back them up. So that grandparent issue, regardless of ethnicity, is one that, as you can tell, I heartily embrace and would encourage every person who has that opportunity to embrace. And sometimes I have to be careful when I talk to people about being a grandparent. They said, oh yeah, we got 4 grandkids. And I say, where do they live? Well, they live in Wisconsin and Colorado. And I go, okay, because mine live 1 mile away. And that allows for that connectedness.
Well, I do remember a comment you had made a while back about grandparenting being the icing on the cake. And that has stuck with me. I think, that I think you're a living example of how that can really be.
A lot of our adoptees are living quite close geographically to their adoptive parents who are now grandparents. So maybe there's less of a need for sort of the constant photos on Facebook and the using those facilities. But for those that are geographically more distant, that's definitely in the data. I think using pictures on Facebook and various apps to video call people is mentioned. In terms of birth family as well, it's quite interesting in terms of who you'll make friends with from the birth family, and who you'll share pictures with and who you won't. So you might block to your birth mother, but you'll be in touch with a cousin through it, even though you'll never have no intention of ever meeting them. Just for some people, just having that very tenuous connection through social media was quite important, even though they didn't want to do anything about it. Having that as an option, that they did have some connection there was quite important. And also there's the this generation, maybe some of them have had some of the unsolicited contact through Facebook in teenage years, so they talk about how they dealt with that. So that's often in the mix as well, and how that was discussed with adopted parents or not, and kind of clandestine meetings with birth family members. And it's definitely in there.
Yeah, Chris, it sounds like you had quite, technology played quite a role in, your story.
Yeah. As a baby placed into foster care and then adopted at age 2, I grew up with the experience of every time I met a new doctor and disclosed that I didn't know who my biological parents were, there was the automatic assumption they needed to test me for everything. Absolutely everything. That was true until the 2010s. I had smoked for many years, and so there was an assumption that was additive, but it might have been because the biological parents were more prone to lung issues, for instance. In the 2010s, I not only paid for the ancestry DNA test, but I paid for the 23andMe test because apparently they gave you different perspectives. Prior to the time my niece found me, indeed, it gave me a lot of information based on my DNA history and on basic patterns of medical research. The phenomenal thing that happened for me was when my niece found me and I began to explore and discover who exactly were these biological parents. Where did they come from? Who were their parents? Who were their parents? And then I realized in a conversation with my physician, Chris, all you need to do, if you will, get the death certificates for those generations. And so, because of technology and because most of it is now computerized, I hold the death certificates for parents, the grandparents, and all of the great grandparents. And every single one of them, with one exception, died of lung related issues. I disclosed that to my doctor, who immediately put me through a round of lung tests and declared me perfectly healthy. It was wonderful. But from that point on, I don't have to be tested for everything. It was phenomenal. So I am a huge, when people ask, is it worth it doing 23andMe? Is it worth doing Ancestry DNA? It sounds like I'm a commercial, especially if they have been adopted and do not have any information about that biological ancestry. If there's any doubt about medical history or medical trajectory, I encourage people to do it because once you do those, people will find them. There will be matches, and you can control that information as an adoptee. You don't have to connect with anybody, but you have that option.
Can I just add one thing here because we're talking about multi-generational families, and I feel it would be remiss not to mention because we intentionally recruited adoptee grandparents who have custody for their grandchildren because of the vulnerabilities of the parent group. Often, if there are problems, the adopters, who are now grandparents, get approached and asked to take custody of the children. So we have many cases of grandparents talking about grandparenting as being the icing on the cake, but we also have quite elderly adopters who are really struggling or enjoying, or both struggling and enjoying this kind of role of being a parent to a toddler again in their 50s and 60s, and having that responsibility of negotiating the relationship with their adult child throughout that. So it's very very complex, and it's definitely in the data. It's a difficult situation to manage for everybody, really.
Many of the members of NACAC, adoptive parents, fit the description that you just made, Julie, of adopting, uh, fostering guardians for their adopted children's children. It's very, very common.
Well, I think we're close to the end of our time, so I wanted to wrap up with one last question to everybody, because a lot of the people who will be watching this video and listening to the presentations will be people who are involved in providing services for various members of the adoption community. And so I'm wondering, maybe from each of you, if you have one kind of thought you want to leave people with about what kinds of services might be needed, or what kinds of services might be helpful that either don't exist today or don't exist sufficiently today to kind of um, be an important support for members touched by adoption. So, Julia, would you like to begin?
Yeah, I mean, this generation that we've interviewed are kind of the first major from care generation. So they're kind of the test bed, really, for a lot of what now exists. So there's actually a lot better provision now for support for adoptive families. But I think once the adoptee reaches age 25, although legally there is precedent for lifelong support, the services that exist are just not really there, and very difficult to find specialist services to deal with identity issues or anything else. And a lot of it you have to fund yourself, or adoptive parents are still funding things. In terms of going through the sort of transition to parenthood, I think peer support would be very useful because of the sort of suspicion, that you might be an inadequate parent because of your care experience. I think there's a lot of nervousness around disclosing difficulties during pregnancy and the transition to parenthood, that if you tell people you've got problems, your child will be removed. So there's that massive fear that someone's going to take the child. So it's very hard to share any problems, especially to the authorities. So how do you get around that? Peer support would be a great way, but it would be also good if there were services that are available too. So yeah, that's the kind of main point I want to make, really.
Great. Thank you. JaeRan.
I think what I was kind of thinking through around this question is just the need for um, providers in general. And I'm talking, and like Julie, what Julie was saying just really made me think about for uh, families who are pregnant, for women who are pregnant, the healthcare providers having a better sense of being more adoption informed, and how that's going to possibly show up. Um, Chris was saying too, in terms of the health, lack of available health data, and how frustrating it is to um, go to a provider and not be able to tell them your family medical history, and then all kinds of assumptions that are placed on you because of that. So I just keep thinking how important just this panel is, and just thinking in general about their whole theme of the conference about adoptees as adults, because um, I think we tend to spend so much time thinking about adoptive families when the kids are young, but as adoptees get older, um, you know, there's just so many different ways for mental health and clinicians to be thinking about when an adult adoptee comes in at age 40 and starts to talk about their adoption identity, or things that are coming up because they're children, or because they have searched, or maybe they're a late discovery adoptee, that so many clinicians, I think, just don't even think about adoption in the context of adults. They only think about adoption in context of children or adoptive parents as adults. So I just think for me, my response is just a need in general for all service providers of any kind to be conscious that adult adoptees are still going to be having needs, and competent providers who can talk through these really complex issues that can surface throughout our lives.
Yes. Thank you. Addie.
Yes, I completely agree. And building off of that, providing more training for therapists, for providers, that at any milestone, whether it's a marriage, parenthood, a divorce, that these issues can come up. And also, in addition to the adoptees, to birth parents, to adoptive parents, to everyone who's in that kinship network to the child of the adult adoptees as they grow older. Definitely expanding that. And I think with thinking about technology too, I mean, with the rise of telemedicine, we have an opportunity to be servicing groups that may not necessarily have found their community locally, but nationally, internationally, could be part of a support group and be able to find that affinity. I think there's a lot of potential there.
Yeah, I agree. And I think even just in terms of disseminating information from a conference like this, this would have been part of a 1 day conference in New England, last year. And actually now I think it's going to have a much broader reach to a much wider group of people over time. Yeah. Yeah. Chris, please.
I'd like to build on what I've heard and also on remarks several of you made, especially Joe. I think there's a lot of education that needs to go on, not only about current mental health providers, but also about the social workers of those young people who are in care. They have some relationship to the system. We need to educate them about the challenges of being adopted. Some adoptions get disrupted. There, there's that issue as well. So I think there's an education piece, but I'd also point to multiple identities And I think several of you have addressed that so beautifully, that it's not simply about I was adopted at an early age and I was reared in an adopted home, but I am also Korean. I am also gay. I am also differently abled. All of those pieces are multiple layers that I think our mental health system is not adequately prepared to help address.
Thank you. And Joe,
Yeah, 21 or 2 years ago, NACAC began a contract with the state of Minnesota to provide peer support to adopted families. And about 12 years ago, we were forced through budget cuts to switch to a virtual support system. And I would argue that it's probably the model virtual support system for adoptive parents in the country. It's through closed Facebook groups that are monitored by staff. And it really is, it allows parents to put a question up and for other parents to respond. A great activity occurs between 10 and midnight. Parents have access to do that. But beyond the group that's now well over 1,000 families, there are subgroups for parents of teens, parents of fetal alcohol syndrome. JaeRan, you probably heard a more recent report. I can't remember all the different groups, but there's 5 or 6 different subgroups. And this allows families to provide support to each other. And one of the nice things pre-COVID is there were also in-person activities, and I would hear reports because these were moms seminars that I didn't go to, and of women meeting each other for the first time after communicating for several years through Facebook and sharing their family stories. And so it was mostly virtual, but it also had in-person components as well. And I think I still believe it's a national model of peer support that the state of Minnesota continues to support.
yeah. Well, thank you so much. I think these are all really important ideas, and I want to thank all of you for being a part of this discussion today. It was a really rich discussion and really nicely building on the work that all of you are doing, and seemed to really build some nice relationships among all of you on the panel as well, which is really an extra bonus. So I want to thank all of you again today so warmly for participating. And just to say to our audience that all of these videos that are being made as part of this series will be available on the Rudd Adoption YouTube page. And so we encourage people to look there and on our Facebook page and on our website. So thank you all very much, and we really appreciate it. Bye.